The sledgehammer crashes into the pool wall with a thunderous crack that echoes through the neighborhood like a gunshot. Sarah's hands shake as concrete crumbles into the emptied basin. 3 years of bitter warfare finally reaching its breaking point. Behind her, Karen's voice rises to a shriek that could shatter glass. "You owe me $15,000 for emotional damages." But what Karen doesn't know, what no one knows, is that Sarah has been recording everything. Every complaint, every threat, every midnight call to code enforcement. And in her pocket, the lawyer's letter that will change everything forever. Part 1. The final swing. The sledgehammer felt heavier than it should have, its weight amplified by 3 years of accumulated rage that had crystallized into this single moment. Sarah Chen gripped the wooden handle until her knuckles went white, her shoulders burning from the repetitive motion of destruction. Each swing sent reverberations up her arms, through her chest, settling somewhere deep in her soul where satisfaction lived. Crack. Another section of the pool's concrete wall crumbled into the drained basin, joining the growing pile of rubble that represented her liberation. Sweat dripped down her face despite the October chill, mixing salt with tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. The pool that had once been her dream, crystal blue water reflecting summer skies, her daughter's laughter echoing off the surface during birthday parties, now looked like a crater in her backyard, a monument to everything that had gone wrong. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The voice cut through the autumn air like a rusty knife. Sarah didn't need to turn around to know who it belonged to. Karen Henderson's shrill tone had become as familiar as her own heartbeat over the past 3 years, a constant soundtrack to her nightmare. Sarah set down the sledgehammer and slowly pivoted to face her neighbor. Karen stood at the property line, her perfectly manicured hands planted on her hips, blonde hair styled into what Sarah privately called her "I want to speak to the manager" helmet. Even at 10 in the morning, Karen wore full makeup and a designer tracksuit that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly mortgage payment. "I'm demolishing my pool," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "On my property." "Your property?" Karen's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "That thing has been ruining my life for 3 years. Do you have any idea what you've put me through? The stress? The sleepless nights? The constant worry about property values." Sarah felt that familiar fire ignite in her chest, the same rage that had sustained her through countless code enforcement visits, lawyer consultations, and restless nights. "Karen, it's a pool. It's completely legal, up to code, and entirely on my side of the property line." Legal doesn't mean considerate. Karen stepped closer, her voice rising to the pitch that made dogs howl 3 blocks away. "I've had to install blackout curtains because of the glare off your water. Do you know how much those curtains cost? Custom fitted, UV blocking, thermal insulated. Nobody forced you to buy curtains," Sarah interrupted, but Karen was building momentum now, like a freight train with failing brakes. "And the noise. The constant splashing, the pool pump running at all hours, those screaming children. My daughter and her friends," Sarah said through gritted teeth. "Disrupting my meditation sessions, my yoga practice, my online business. Meetings with very important clients, Karen." Sarah's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "I'm taking the pool down. Isn't that what you wanted?" For a moment, Karen's mouth hung open, as if she'd been prepared for another 3-hour argument and didn't know how to process victory. Then her eyes narrowed, and Sarah recognized the look. It was the same expression Karen got before she called code enforcement for the 15th time, or before she filed another complaint with the homeowners association, or before she stood in Sarah's driveway at midnight demanding satisfaction for some imagined slight. "Taking it down isn't enough," Karen said, her voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow felt more threatening than her screaming. "Not after what you've put me through." Sarah picked up the sledgehammer again, testing its weight. "What are you talking about?" "Compensation." Karen pulled out her phone and began scrolling through what looked like a very long document. "I've been keeping track. Detailed records of every single incident, every inconvenience, every moment of suffering you've caused me. The absurdity of it should have been funny. Standing in the wreckage of her own dream, being lectured by a woman who had made her life hell for 3 years, Sarah should have laughed. Instead, she felt something cold settle in her stomach. "I've calculated the damages," Karen continued, still scrolling. "The curtains, the sleep aids, the stress therapy, the property value impact, the lost productivity from my online wellness coaching business. You're what?" I'm a certified life coach and wellness influencer, Karen said with the dignity of someone announcing a Nobel Prize. I have 17 followers on Instagram. Had 18, but Mrs. Patterson unfollowed me after you hosted that pool party last summer. Sarah blinked. You want me to pay you because someone unfollowed your Instagram? That's just one item on a very long list. Karen's thumb continued its journey through the document. The total comes to $15,437. Plus interest. The number hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Sarah felt the world tilt slightly, as if the earth itself was trying to process the magnitude of Karen's delusion. You're insane, Sarah whispered. I'm thorough, Karen corrected. And I'm being generous. My initial calculation was over 20,000, but I rounded down because we are neighbors. Sarah raised the sledgehammer, not as a threat, but because she needed something solid to hold on to. Karen, I'm not paying you a single penny. Oh, but you are. Karen's smile was sharp enough to perform surgery. Because if you don't, I'm filing a lawsuit. Intentional infliction of emotional distress. Negligent interference with the quiet enjoyment of property. Nuisance. My brother-in-law is a lawyer, and he says I have an excellent case. Your brother-in-law sells insurance in Toledo. He went to law school 20 years ago, and he never passed the bar. Karen's face flushed red, but her voice remained level. I've consulted with other attorneys. Real ones. They all agree that you've created a hostile living environment that has materially impacted my quality of life. Sarah felt the fight drain out of her. 3 years of this madness, and even destroying the pool wasn't enough. Karen would never stop. She would find new things to complain about, new ways to make Sarah's life miserable, new reasons to demand compensation for the simple fact that Sarah existed in the house next door. I need to think about this, Sarah said finally. You have 48 hours, Karen announced, as if she were delivering an ultimatum from the United Nations. After that, my attorney files the paperwork. Karen turned and walked back toward her house, her designer sneakers crunching on the fallen leaves that had drifted across both properties. At her back door, she paused and called out, Oh, and Sarah? That demolition debris needs to be cleaned up within 24 hours. It's a code violation to leave construction materials exposed to the elements. The door slammed shut with enough force to rattle the windows. Sarah stood alone in her backyard, surrounded by the ruins of what used to be her sanctuary. The sledgehammer felt impossibly heavy now, like it was made of lead instead of steel. She let it drop to the ground, where it landed with a dull thud that seemed to echo her defeat. $15,000. For the crime of having a pool. For the sin of enjoying her own property. For the audacity of living her life without Karen's permission. Sarah walked over to the concrete rubble and sat down on the largest chunk, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. The October wind picked up, scattering leaves across the destruction site like confetti at a funeral. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she'd been avoiding for weeks. David Martinez, the attorney who'd handled her divorce, had told her months ago that she might need legal help with the Karen situation. She'd laughed it off then, thinking that no reasonable person would actually sue a neighbor over a pool. But reasonable had never been part of Karen's vocabulary. The phone rang twice before David picked up. Sarah, how are you holding up? I need help, she said, and the words felt like admitting defeat. Karen's demanding $15,000 in damages because I had a pool. Had. I'm demolishing it. Right now. But apparently that's not enough. There was a long pause. Sarah, are you somewhere private where we can talk? She looked around her empty backyard, at the hole where her dreams used to live, at Karen's house with its perfect lawn and judgmental windows. As private as it gets. Good. Because there's something I need to tell you about Karen Henderson. Something I've been waiting for the right moment to share. Sarah's heart stopped. What do you mean? Remember how I told you to keep records of everything? Every complaint, every interaction, every crazy demand. Yeah, I've got boxes of documentation. Well, so do I. Because Karen isn't just your problem, Sarah. She's been doing this for years, to multiple neighbors, in multiple neighborhoods. And there's a pattern. The wind picked up again, and Sarah pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders. What kind of pay? David Martinez's law office smelled like leather and disappointment, with just a hint of the coffee that had been brewing too long. Sarah sat in the worn chair across from his desk, a manila folder thick with documentation spread between them like evidence at a crime scene. Outside, rush hour traffic crawled past the windows, but inside, the world had narrowed to the photographs and legal documents that painted a picture she was still struggling to believe. This is the Hendersons' previous address, David said, sliding a property record across the desk. Maple Grove subdivision, about 15 miles from where you live now. They moved there in 2018. Sarah picked up the document, studying the address. Okay, so this is what happened to their neighbor. David placed a newspaper clipping next to the property record. The headline made Sarah's blood run cold. Local man declares bankruptcy after frivolous lawsuit settlement. The article was short, buried on page 6 of the local news section, but every word hit like a physical blow. Robert Chen, no relation, despite the shared last name, had installed a deck in his backyard in 2019. His neighbor, one Karen Henderson, had filed a lawsuit claiming the deck violated her privacy and had caused her severe emotional distress. After 18 months of legal battles that cost him nearly $40,000 in attorney fees, Chen had agreed to a settlement of $12,000 just to make it stop. My God, Sarah whispered. She destroyed this man. Keep reading. David's voice was grim. Sarah flipped through the folder, finding more documents, more stories. The Hendersons had lived in 4 different neighborhoods over the past 8 years. In each one, the pattern was identical. They would find a neighbor who had made some kind of property improvement, a pool, a deck, a shed, a fence, and Karen would begin her campaign. It always started the same way. Complaints about noise, privacy violations, property values. Then came the escalation, calls to code enforcement, homeowners association complaints, demands for discussions that turned into screaming matches. Finally, the ultimatum, pay up or face a lawsuit. The Riverside Drive incident was the worst, David said, pointing to a particularly thick section of the folder. The neighbor had installed a hot tub. Karen claimed the steam was causing mold. Damage to her siding. She demanded $30,000 in damages. Did she get it? $22,000. The family had a special needs child and couldn't afford a protracted legal battle. They paid her and moved away 6 months later. Sarah felt sick. How many people? 7 families that I've been able to document. Probably more. David leaned back in his chair, his expression hard. The Hendersons move every 2 to 3 years, always to middle-class neighborhoods where people have something to lose but not enough money to fight back indefinitely. It's a scam. It's extortion. But it's also brilliant, in a sociopathic way. Karen never asks for amounts large enough to trigger serious fraud investigations. She always has just enough legitimate-sounding complaints to make the threats feel real. And she targets people who are emotionally invested in their homes, who can't just walk away. Sarah stared at the photographs scattered across the desk. 7 families. 7 homes that people had loved and lost because of Karen Henderson's manufactured outrage. Why didn't anyone report her? Who were they going to report her to? She's not technically breaking any laws. Filing lawsuits is legal, even frivolous. Ones. Demanding compensation for emotional distress is legal. Being a terrible neighbor isn't a crime. But there has to be something. There is. David's smile was sharp as a razor blade. Mail fraud. Sarah blinked. What? David pulled out another document, this one bearing the official seal of the United States Postal Inspection Service. Remember how Karen always sends her demands and complaints through certified mail? Return receipt requested, signature required. Yeah, she's obsessed with documentation. Well, that documentation is about to bite her in the ass. David opened the document, revealing pages of financial records, bank statements, and transaction histories. The postal inspectors have been tracking her for 6 months. Every time she moves to a new neighborhood, she establishes a pattern of using the mail system to facilitate what they're calling systematic neighbor intimidation for financial gain. Sarah's heart began to race. That's illegal. Mail fraud is a federal crime. 20 years in prison, up to $1 million in fines. And that's just the federal charges. David grinned. The state attorney general is also interested in filing racketeering charges under the RICO Act. RICO. Like organized crime. Exactly like organized crime. Karen has been running a systematic scheme to defraud homeowners across multiple jurisdictions. The pattern is so clear that even a first-year law student could prove it. Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Hope. Pure, crystalline hope that made her hands shake and her eyes fill with tears. When? Tomorrow morning. Federal agents will execute search warrants simultaneously at the Henderson residence and at her husband's office. Turns out he's been helping her research property records and identify targets. The room spun slightly. Sarah gripped the arms of her chair, trying to process the magnitude of what David was telling her. They're both going to be arrested. Arrested, charged, and if the prosecutors are right, convicted on multiple federal charges. David gathered the documents back into the folder. But here's the beautiful part, Sarah. The beautiful, perfect, karmic justice part. What? Remember how I told you to keep records of everything? Every interaction, every demand, every crazy complaint. Sarah nodded. Those records aren't just evidence of harassment. They're evidence of attempted mail fraud. And under federal law, victims of mail fraud are entitled to treble damages. Treble. Triple. Karen demanded $15,000 from you. If she's convicted, you can sue her for $45,000, plus attorney fees, plus punitive damages. Sarah's mouth fell open. You're kidding. I never kid about money. David leaned forward, his expression intense. But there's more. Every family she scammed over the past 8 years, they're all potential plaintiffs in a class action lawsuit. The total damages could reach $500,000. The number was so large that Sarah couldn't quite comprehend it. $500,000. Karen, who had spent 3 years making her life miserable over a perfectly legal pool, could be facing bankruptcy, prison, and civil liability that would follow her for the rest of her life. I can't believe this is really happening, Sarah whispered. Believe it. The postal inspectors have been building this case for months. Your documentation was actually the final piece they needed to establish the pattern across state lines. Sarah thought about all those nights she'd stayed up late, carefully documenting Karen's latest outrage, photographing the certified mail receipts, recording the screaming phone calls. She'd felt like she was going crazy, like she was the only person who could see how insane the situation had become. Turns out, she'd been building a federal case. What happens now? Now. David stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the evening traffic. Now you go home, finish demolishing that pool if you want to, and wait for the show to begin. Should I warn her? I mean, shouldn't I, Sarah? David's voice was firm. Karen Henderson has spent the better part of a decade destroying families for profit. She's stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from people who trusted that their neighbors were acting in good faith. She's forced children out of their homes and driven good people to bankruptcy. Sarah nodded slowly. Tomorrow morning, justice catches up with her. Don't you dare feel guilty about that. Sarah gathered her purse and stood to leave, but paused at the door. David, what made you start investigating her in the first place? His smile was sad. Because you weren't the first person to come to me with a Karen Henderson problem. About a year ago, I had a client, elderly gentleman who'd built a small greenhouse in his backyard. Karen moved in next door and immediately started complaining about commercial agricultural activity on a residential lot. What happened? He paid her $8,000 rather than fight. Died of a heart attack 6 months later. His daughter blamed the stress. David's expression hardened. Some people deserve what's coming to them, Sarah. Karen Henderson is definitely one of them. Sarah walked out of the law office into the cool evening air, her mind reeling with everything she'd learned. The streetlights were just coming on, casting long shadows across the sidewalk as she made her way to her car. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number. This is your final warning. Payment in full by tomorrow at 5 p.m. or my attorney files the lawsuit. Don't test me. Karen, Sarah stared at the message for a long moment, then began typing her response. See you tomorrow, Karen. She hit send and started her car, driving home through streets that suddenly felt different. Lighter, as if a weight she'd been carrying for 3 years had finally been lifted from her shoulders. In her rearview mirror, she could see David's office building growing smaller in the distance. But ahead of her, the road stretched out like a promise. Tomorrow was going to be a very interesting day. Sarah's coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but she couldn't bring herself to move from her kitchen window. At 6:47 a.m., the Henderson house looked exactly as it always did. Pristine lawn, perfectly arranged seasonal decorations, not a single leaf. Out of place. Karen's white BMW sat in the driveway next to her husband Ron's silver sedan, both vehicles gleaming under the morning sun like they'd been detailed yesterday. Which, knowing Karen, they probably had been. Sarah's phone buzzed. David Martinez. Federal agents en route. At 7:15 a.m. Stay inside and keep your phone handy. Her hands trembled as she typed back, "How will I know when it's happening?" "Trust me. You'll know." The next 28 minutes crawled by like hours. Sarah found herself pacing between the kitchen window and the living room, unable to sit still, unable to focus on anything except the ordinary suburban morning unfolding outside. A jogger passed by, earbuds in, completely unaware that he was about to witness the end of Karen Henderson's criminal enterprise. Mrs. Patterson from 2 houses down emerged to collect her newspaper, waving cheerfully at Sarah through the window. Normal. Everything looked completely normal. At exactly 7:15 a.m., a black SUV rounded the corner. Then another. And another. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as 3 identical vehicles pulled up in front of the Henderson house, followed by a white van with U.S. Postal Inspection Service printed in block letters on the side. Men and women in dark suits emerged from the SUVs with the kind of purposeful movement that made Sarah's pulse race. "Oh my God," she whispered. "It's really happening." Through Karen's front window, Sarah could see movement, a figure in a bathrobe. Probably Ron, walking toward the door. The lead agent stepped up to the porch and knocked, the sound carrying across the quiet morning air like gunshots. Sarah's phone rang. "David, are you watching?" he asked without preamble. "I can't believe this is real." It's about to get more real. The search warrants cover the house, both vehicles, Ron's office, and Karen's computer equipment. They are looking for financial records, correspondence, and evidence of the mail fraud scheme. The front door opened. Ron Henderson appeared, still in his pajamas, his face a mask of confusion that quickly shifted to alarm as the lead agent displayed his badge and handed him a document. Even from her kitchen window, Sarah could see Ron's shoulders sag as he read the search warrant. "Where's Karen?" David asked. Sarah squinted across the yard. "I don't see her yet. Wait. There she is." Karen appeared behind Ron, and even at a distance, Sarah could read her body language. The rigid posture, the sharp gestures, the way she seemed to be lecturing the federal agents as if they were particularly slow children who had interrupted her morning routine. "She's arguing with them," Sarah reported. "Of course she is. Karen. Henderson has never met an authority figure she didn't think she could intimidate." More agents emerged from the van, carrying boxes and electronic equipment. They moved with practiced efficiency, splitting into teams that disappeared into different parts of the house. Ron stepped aside to let them pass, but Karen planted herself in the doorway like she was defending the Alamo. "She's not letting them in," Sarah said. "She doesn't have a choice. Federal search warrant trumps homeowners' rights." As if summoned by David's words, 2 agents flanked Karen, gently but firmly, moving her away from the door. Sarah watched Karen's mouth move, probably unleashing the same torrent of indignant fury that had made Sarah's life hell for 3 years. The difference was, these people had badges and the full weight of the federal government behind them. "David, I think I'm having a panic attack," Sarah said, realizing she'd been holding her breath. "That's adrenaline. Perfectly normal response to watching justice unfold. Just breathe." A new vehicle pulled up, this one unmarked but clearly official, with government plates and tinted windows. A woman in a crisp business suit emerged, carrying a briefcase and moving with the kind of authority that made everyone else step aside. "Who's that?" "If I had to guess, Assistant U.S. Attorney. They don't usually show up for simple search warrants unless they're planning to make arrests." "Arrests? Today?" "The postal inspectors have been building this case for months, Sarah. They wouldn't move this fast unless they had everything they needed." Through the Hendersons' picture window, Sarah could see agents moving through the house, photographing everything, opening drawers and cabinets, treating Karen's perfect home like a crime scene. Because that's exactly what it was. Karen appeared on the front lawn, gesticulating wildly at the woman with the briefcase. Even without sound, the scene was easy to read. Karen in full attack mode, demanding explanations, threatening lawsuits, probably insisting that this was all a terrible mistake that would be resolved as soon as she spoke to someone in charge. The federal prosecutor listened with the patience of someone who had dealt with entitled criminals before, occasionally nodding or asking what appeared to be clarifying questions. Karen's body language grew more animated with each exchange, her hand movements more aggressive. Then the prosecutor reached into her briefcase and pulled out a document. David, she's showing Karen something. A paper. Probably the indictment. The word hit Sarah like a physical blow. They're actually arresting her. The grand jury returned a sealed indictment yesterday afternoon. 23 counts of mail fraud, conspiracy to commit extortion, and racketeering under the RICO Act. Sarah watched Karen read the document, her face transforming from indignant fury to pale shock. The paper fluttered in her hands like a wounded bird. How long could she go to prison? If convicted on all counts, 30 to 40 years. She'll be eligible for parole in about 30 years. Sarah did the math quickly. Karen was 52 years old. She would be in her 70s before she saw freedom again, assuming she lived that long. The woman who had spent 3 years making Sarah's life miserable over a perfectly legal pool would spend the rest of her productive life in a federal penitentiary. Another agent approached Karen, this one carrying handcuffs. "Oh God, they're really doing it," Sarah whispered. Karen stepped backward, shaking her head, probably still insisting this was all a mistake. The agent spoke to her calmly, professionally, the way you might explain something to a child. Sarah couldn't hear the words, but she recognized the tone. She'd heard it before, from police officers and court officials during her divorce. You have the right to remain silent. The handcuffs clicked into place with a sound that Sarah felt more than heard. Karen Henderson, neighborhood tyrant, systematic extortionist, destroyer of families, stood on her perfect lawn in her designer tracksuit with her hands cuffed behind her back like a common criminal. Which, Sarah realized, was exactly what she was. Ron emerged from the house, escorted by 2 agents, his own hands secured behind his back. His face was grey, the color of a man who had just watched his entire world collapse in the span of 30 minutes. They got both of them, Sarah said. Ron was instrumental in the scheme. He handled the research, identified targets, helped Karen craft her complaints to sound legally plausible. He's looking at 15 to 20 years as an accessory. Sarah watched as both Hendersons were placed in separate vehicles, their heads bowed, their perfect life crumbling around them like poorly mixed concrete. The agents continued their methodical search of the house, carrying out boxes of evidence, computers, file cabinets, the accumulated documentation of an 8-year crime spree. The neighbors were beginning to emerge now. Mrs. Patterson stood on her front step, hands pressed to her mouth in shock. The family across the street had gathered on their porch, parents trying to explain to confused children why people in suits were carrying things out of the Henderson house. Sarah's doorbell rang. Her heart nearly stopped. Through the peephole, she could see the federal prosecutor standing on her porch, briefcase in hand, expression professional but not unkind. Sarah opened the door slowly. "Ms. Chen, I'm Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Morrison. I wondered if we might have a moment to talk." "Of course. Please, come in." Morrison entered Sarah's living room, declining the offer of coffee but accepting a seat on the couch. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder that Sarah recognized. It was identical to the one David had shown her yesterday. "I want to thank you," Morrison said without preamble. "Your documentation of Karen Henderson's harassment campaign was instrumental in building our case. I just wrote down what happened. You did more than that. You provided a clear timeline of escalating demands, threats, and extortion attempts. Combined with similar documentation from victims in other neighborhoods, your records helped us establish the pattern that made this a federal case." Sarah sank into her chair, still struggling to process everything. "What happens now?" "Now we prepare for trial. The Hendersons will likely be offered plea agreements, but given the scope of their crimes, they're looking at significant prison time regardless." And their victims. Morrison smiled, the first genuine warmth Sarah had seen from her. That's where things get interesting. Under federal victim restitution laws, the Hendersons will be required to pay back every penny they stole, plus interest. And penalties. Their assets, the house, the cars, the bank accounts, will be seized and liquidated to compensate their victims. Sarah thought about all the families Karen had. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in the Hendersons' living room, surrounded by everything Karen had once held dear. The federal asset forfeiture auction was scheduled to begin in an hour, and potential buyers wandered through the house like scavengers picking through the bones of a fallen empire. Lot 47, designer kitchen appliances, stainless steel, barely used. The auctioneer's assistant announced to a small crowd gathered around Karen's prized Viking range. The same stove where Karen had probably planned her next extortion. Scheme over morning coffee was now being appraised like any other piece of used merchandise. Sarah's phone buzzed. David Martinez. How does it feel to watch karma get an auction paddle? She typed back, surreal. Also deeply satisfying. The house felt different without the Hendersons' presence, smaller somehow, as if their toxic energy had been inflating it like a balloon. The walls that had once seemed to radiate judgment and superiority now looked like what they'd always been, just drywall and paint in a subdivision that was indistinguishable from 1,000 others. Sarah Chen. She turned to find a woman about her own age, holding a young girl's hand. The woman's face was cautiously hopeful, but her eyes held the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust good news. Yes. I'm Jennifer Walsh. This is my daughter Emma. The woman's voice shook slightly. We lived on Riverside Drive. Karen Henderson. She made us pay $22,000 because of our hot tub. Sarah's heart clenched. This was one of the families from David's files. One of Karen's earlier victims. I'm so sorry. What she did to you was unconscionable. We lost our house, Jennifer continued, her grip tightening on her daughter's hand. Had to move in with my parents. Emma had to change schools, leave all her friends. The little girl looked up at Sarah with solemn brown eyes. Are you the lady who caught the mean woman? Sarah knelt down to Emma's level. I helped, but mostly, she caught herself by being mean to too many people. Good, Emma said with the fierce certainty of childhood. Mean people should get in trouble. Jennifer wiped her eyes. The prosecutor called us yesterday. Said we might get some of our money back from the asset sales. I hope you get every penny, Sarah said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. More people began filtering into the house. Other neighbors, bargain hunters, and what Sarah recognized as other victims. She could spot them easily now, the way their eyes held a mixture of hurt and vindication as they walked through the rooms. Where their tormentor had lived. The elderly man examining Karen's china cabinet had the careful movements of someone who had learned to be invisible to avoid conflict. The young couple studying the living room furniture whispered to each other with the intensity of people who had been through hell together. These were Karen's casualties, come to witness the final dismantling of the life she had built with their stolen money. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the federal asset forfeiture auction for seized property in the matter of United States versus Henderson. The auctioneer was a portly man with the practiced enthusiasm of someone who sold other people's misery. For a living. All proceeds from today's sale will be held in escrow pending victim restitution proceedings. Sarah found herself drawn to Karen's home office, where the woman had planned her campaigns of terror with the methodical precision of a military strategist. The desk was gone, seized as evidence, but the room still held the residual energy of calculated malice. Lot 73, extensive filing system, oak construction, perfect for the home office. The filing cabinets where Karen had stored her documentation of every neighbor's infractions were being sold like any other office. Furniture. Sarah wondered if the buyers had any idea what those drawers had once contained. The photographs of children playing too loudly, the property surveys marked with angry red ink, the draft complaints that would never be filed. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Sarah Chen. This is Detective Lisa Rodriguez with the Municipal Fraud Division. I wondered if we might speak. Sarah stepped out of the house, away from the auction noise. Of course. We've been reviewing the evidence seized from the Henderson residence, and we've uncovered something that might interest you. Are you familiar with the Hendersons' insurance claims history? No, should I be? Over the past 8 years, Karen Henderson has filed 17 separate insurance claims for property damage allegedly caused by neighbors. Water damage, noise-related stress injuries, property value impacts, you name it. Sarah leaned against her car, the implications starting to sink in. She was defrauding insurance companies too. It appears so. The total claims amount to over $200,000. Most were settled out of court for smaller amounts, but the pattern is unmistakable. $200,000. Sarah thought about Jennifer Walsh and her daughter, about the elderly man who died of a heart attack, about all the families who had paid Karen's demands thinking they were dealing with a difficult neighbor instead of a career criminal. What does this mean for the victims? It means the Hendersons' crimes go far beyond mail fraud and extortion. Insurance fraud is a separate federal offense with its own penalties. More importantly for you and the other victims, it means there are additional assets to recover. Detective Rodriguez paused, and Sarah could hear papers rustling in the background. There's something else. Karen Henderson kept meticulous records of everything, and I mean everything. We found a spreadsheet on her computer titled Neighborhood Projects with detailed information about dozens of potential targets. Sarah's blood went cold. Targets. Properties she was monitoring for future schemes. Your name was on there, along with notes about your pool installation date, estimated property value increase, and something called exploitation timeline. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had never been a neighbor to Karen Henderson. She had been a mark, a carefully selected victim in a long-term financial crime. Every friendly conversation, every wave across the yard, every interaction had been part of Karen's assessment of her as a target. Ms. Chen, are you still there? Yes, sorry. It's just the idea that she was planning this from the beginning. I'm afraid it gets worse. According to her records, she began researching your property 6 months before. You installed the pool. She knew about the permit applications before you did. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the last vestiges of guilt or sympathy evaporate completely. Karen hadn't been a difficult neighbor driven to desperation by pool noise. She had been a predator. And Sarah had walked into her trap with the trusting naivety of someone who believed that neighbors were fundamentally decent people. The good news, Rodriguez continued, is that this additional evidence strengthens the federal case considerably. The prosecutors are confident that both Hendersons will plead guilty rather than face trial. When? Next week. Karen's attorney has been negotiating for months, trying to minimize her sentence, but the evidence is overwhelming. She's looking at 25 to 30 years in federal prison. Sarah watched as auction attendees carried items out of the Henderson house: lamps, furniture, artwork, all the material possessions that Karen had accumulated with stolen money. Each piece represented someone's suffering, someone's financial ruin, someone's broken trust in the basic decency of human nature. Detective Rodriguez? What happens to people like Karen Henderson in prison? There was a long pause. Inmates who prey on families and children don't typically have an easy time. Prison has its own sense of justice. Sarah hung up and walked back toward the auction, but stopped at the property line between her yard and the Hendersons. For 3 years, this invisible boundary had been a battlefield, with Karen treating every blade of grass that crossed it as an act of war. Now it was just a line in the dirt between two pieces of property, no more significant than any other arbitrary division of suburban space. Sarah. She turned to find Mrs. Patterson hurrying across the street, moving faster than Sarah had seen her move in years. Did you hear the news about the plea agreement? What news? Mrs. Patterson's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of someone delivering particularly juicy gossip. My nephew works at the courthouse. Karen Henderson agreed to plead guilty to all charges this morning. Sarah's heart stopped. All of them. Every single count. 27 federal charges, plus the state charges for insurance fraud. The judge accepted the plea an hour ago. What's her sentence? 32 years in federal prison, no possibility of parole for 20 years. Mrs. Patterson's smile was sharp as a knife. Ron got 18 years as an accessory. 32 years. Karen Henderson was 52 years old. She would be in her 80s before she saw freedom again, assuming she lived that long. The woman who had terrorized neighborhoods with the methodical precision of a military campaign would spend the rest of her life in a concrete cell, subject to the same arbitrary authority she had once wielded over others. There's more, Mrs. Patterson continued, clearly enjoying her role as harbinger of justice. The judge ordered full restitution to all victims, plus punitive damages. The total amount is over $800,000. Sarah felt the world tilt slightly. $800,000. Every penny she stole, plus interest and penalties. The house, the cars, the bank accounts, even her jewelry, everything get. 6 months later, Sarah stood in her backyard watching her contractors crew pour concrete for the foundation of her new pool house. Where the old pool had been a crater of defeat, now there would be something better, a space designed not just for swimming, but for living, for healing, for reclaiming the joy that Karen Henderson had tried so hard to steal. It's going to be beautiful, said Emma Walsh, who was perched on Sarah's back porch with a glass of lemonade, watching the construction with the fascination that only 8-year-old girls could muster. Will it have a diving board? 2 diving boards, Sarah confirmed, earning a squeal of delight that would have sent Karen into apoplectic rage 6 months ago. Now it was just the sound of childhood happiness, exactly as it should be. Jennifer Walsh emerged from the house carrying a plate of sandwiches for the construction crew. The restitution money had allowed her family to buy a house 3 blocks away, not as large as the one they'd lost, but theirs again, free and clear. Emma had started at the local elementary school in September, making friends with the fearless determination of a child who had learned that mean people eventually get what they deserve. The victims' compensation meeting is next week, Jennifer said, settling into a chair beside Sarah. David thinks we might see additional funds from the insurance fraud settlements. Sarah nodded, though money had ceased to be the point months ago. The check from a Henderson asset liquidation had been substantial, nearly $60,000, triple the amount Karen had demanded as compensation for her imaginary suffering. Sarah had used it to pay off her mortgage and fund the new pool house, but the real victory wasn't financial. The real victory was the silence. No more certified mail with return receipt requested. No more midnight phone calls about noise violations. No more surprise visits from code enforcement officers who apologized profusely while explaining that they were required to follow up on every complaint, no matter how obviously frivolous. The silence was deafening in the most beautiful way. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number made her heart skip a beat for just a moment. 3 years of Karen's harassment had left some reflexive anxiety that would probably never completely fade. But the message was from David Martinez, texting from a new phone. Turn on Channel 7. Special investigative report about Karen's crimes. You're going to want to see this. Sarah grabbed the remote and switched to the local news station. A familiar reporter appeared on screen, standing in front of what Sarah recognized as the federal courthouse downtown. Good evening. I'm Amanda Chen with a Channel 7 special investigation. 6 months ago, federal agents arrested a local woman for what prosecutors called one of the most sophisticated neighbor intimidation schemes in recent memory. Tonight, we have exclusive access to the evidence that brought down Karen Henderson's criminal empire. The screen filled with photographs of Karen's victims, dozens of them, from multiple states, spanning nearly a decade of systematic extortion. Sarah recognized some faces from the victim meetings, but many were strangers whose lives had been quietly destroyed far from the media spotlight. Federal prosecutors say Henderson and her husband targeted middle-class families who had made improvements to their properties, using frivolous complaints and threats of expensive litigation to extort hundreds of thousands of dollars in settlements. The report showed Karen's spreadsheets, her detailed target lists, her methodical documentation of each family's vulnerabilities. The reporter's voice remained professional, but Sarah could hear the underlying anger as she described the scope of the crimes. Among Henderson's victims were elderly homeowners on fixed incomes, families with special needs children, and at least 3 families who lost their homes entirely due to the financial pressure of fighting her lawsuits. The camera cut to interview footage with Robert Chen, the man who had gone bankrupt fighting Karen over his deck. He looked older than his years, worn down by the experience, but his voice was steady as he spoke. She wasn't just a difficult neighbor. She was a predator who used the legal system as a weapon. I'm glad she'll never be able to do this to another family. Emma Walsh looked up from her lemonade. Is that the mean lady who tried to take your house? That's her, Sarah confirmed. But she can't hurt anyone anymore. The news report continued, showing footage of the federal courthouse where Karen had entered her guilty plea. The woman who had once terrorized neighborhoods with her demands and threats had looked small and defeated in her orange jumpsuit, flanked by federal marshals who treated her with the professional indifference reserved for common criminals. Henderson is currently serving her sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut, a medium-security facility approximately 800 miles from the neighborhood she once terrorized. 800 miles. Sarah found herself smiling at the cosmic justice of it. Karen, who had obsessed over property lines and complained about children playing in their own backyards, was now confined to a concrete cell roughly the size of a walk-in closet, sharing her space with someone else's rules and someone else's schedule. The investigation into Henderson's crimes has led to changes in how local authorities handle neighbor disputes, the reporter continued. Police departments across 3 states have implemented new protocols to identify patterns of harassment and prevent similar schemes in the future. The report concluded with a statement from Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Morrison. This case demonstrates that the justice system has a long reach and a longer memory. People who think they can terrorize their neighbors with impunity should take note. We are watching, we are documenting, and we will hold you accountable. Sarah turned off the television and walked back outside, where the construction crew was cleaning up for the day. The pool house foundation was taking shape, a structure that would provide changing rooms, storage, and a small kitchen area for pool parties. For Emma Walsh's birthday celebrations and Jennifer's book club meetings and all the other normal, joyful activities that Karen had tried so hard to criminalize. Her phone rang. David Martinez. Did you watch it? Every minute. It felt like watching a nature documentary about the extinction of a particularly nasty species. David laughed. I thought you'd appreciate the final detail they didn't mention on air. Want to hear it? Always. Karen's cellmate is a woman named Dolores Martinez. No relation, unfortunately. She's serving 15 years for running a telemarketing scam that targeted elderly victims. According to my contact at the Bureau of Prisons, Dolores has very strong opinions about people who prey on families and children. Sarah felt a smile spread across her face. Are you telling me that Karen Henderson is being forced to share 8 by 10 feet of space with someone who thinks she's a monster? For the next 20 years, assuming she survives that long, Dolores is apparently not what you'd call a quiet roommate. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Sarah hung up and walked to the edge of her property, standing at the exact spot where she'd confronted Karen for the last time. The Henderson house had sold to a young family with 3 children who had already installed a swing set and a sandbox in the backyard. The new neighbors had introduced themselves with homemade cookies and apologies for any noise their kids might make. Sarah had laughed and told them that the sound of children playing was the most beautiful music in the world. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the windows of houses where families were gathering for dinner, children were finishing homework, and normal people were living normal lives without fear of harassment or extortion. Emma Walsh ran up from the construction site, her face glowing with excitement. Sarah, the man said they're going to start filling it with water next week. Can we have a pool party when it's done? The biggest pool party this neighborhood has ever seen, Sarah promised, with diving contests and water volleyball and music that's loud enough to hear 3 blocks away. Won't the neighbors complain? Sarah looked around at the houses where good people lived, people who understood that children's laughter was not a crime, that property improvements were achievements to celebrate rather than opportunities for extortion, that being a neighbor meant being part of a community instead of waging war against it. Let them try, she said, and for the first time in 3 years, she meant it with complete confidence. Because Karen Henderson was gone. Her house belonged to a family who appreciated the sound of splashing water and birthday party screams. Her criminal enterprise had been dismantled piece by piece, her victims compensated, her methods exposed to prevent future predators from following her example. And she would spend the next 20 years learning what it felt like to have no control over her environment, no power over her neighbors, no ability to demand compensation for every minor inconvenience life threw her way. That night, Sarah fell asleep to the sound of children playing in the new neighbor's backyard, their voices carrying across the property line like a lullaby. In the morning, she would wake up without checking her mailbox for threatening letters. She would start her coffee without wondering what complaint Karen might file that day. She would live her life without the constant low-level fear that had been her companion for 3 years. Karen Henderson.